Hello, hello.
Yes. I know,
We're
right?
on. Yeah.
How are we? Well, I missed the bing. Hey,
Well, you
over
were
here.
looking away at the
I
time. What are you
was. I was.
doing?
I'm
It's,
sorry.
aren't you a professional after all this time? Talking about
Uh,
Thomas Paine?
Telling you about myself. Well, I'm just so excited about our upcoming tour, time together, Rick, on the Rev War tour that I
I
just invited all.
understand that. Calling Chris Anderson in London. How are
I am.
you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing in Chicago, where I hear it's colder than hell?
It is cold today, but it's getting a lot colder. It's going down to like zero overnight. And I see the various weather reports that people are posting here. And I know
So
that
what?
many, what?
Like, do you have like tunnels or something to get around, or like what? That's crazy.
No, that's Minneapolis. Hey, welcome
Oh,
everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Steve Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening on the HHH podcast,
yes.
yes, we're glad you're here today. And we'll be talking about a pivotal year in the life of Winston Churchill during today's show. And there's no football on for the last first time in 6 months or
So we
so.
have a big show.
So we expect to have tens of thousands of viewers, dropping in. Let us know if you got a cocktail. Let us know what you've got and what you're drinking there. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon. We do definitely appreciate all of our Patreon
Which is
supporters, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join this august group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour. Do
okay.
that after today's show, please.
Immediately
Let's,
after today.
yes, immediately after the show. And, bring us the treasure. We need the treasure. No blood, just treasure.
No, but,
Chris, who's out there? Who's
yeah.
who's
Well,
who's
well,
come to
we
us
have
today?
Gene Templin, and he's enduring a snowstorm in Pennsylvania. Ann Bryan from Little Rock, and Barry Milgate, so from closer home to me in Stafford, UK. Nancy Nylands is back from Texas. Ken from Kansas. Xavier's with us, so
I see
all is well
Xavier
with the world. Yep, yeah. Who
and
else is
snow
here?
in Helena, as Catherine Anderson tells us, and it's cold in Little Rock, Suzanne. So we got lots of interesting people. And Dave Borland and family. It says Borland family. I'm just assuming it's Dave and
Yep.
maybe other members of the family up in Evanston. Okay, so we've killed some time here. We
Yep.
can probably get this show underway. Give me a
I think
cue,
so.
and I'll see if I can find the open here.
All right. Fingers are ready.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nope. The
Who was looking away
bars
that time?
bar is open, and clearly the drinking has already
Yeah.
begun. Um, in 1915, Winston Churchill resigned as Lord of the Admiralty in the wake of the Dardanelles disaster, and we'll talk about what that was. He eventually joined the army and headed for the front lines, where he learned lessons that would help him stage his political comeback over the next few years of his life. And we're going to chat about that today with our guest, J. Furman Daniel, who is the author of the book Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint: The Remarkable Year That Made Winston Churchill. And Dr. Daniel is a professor of political science at Concordia University in suburban Chicago, and is the author of 4 books, including The First Space War and Patton: Battling with History. 2 really different titles there. Furman Daniel, welcome to History Happy
Welcome.
Hour.
Rick, Chris, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for joining us.
We're delighted to have you, and I hope you're ready for it. Did you bring a fortifying cocktail?
I did indeed. So cheers.
All right, he's popping down the Guinness there. What do you got, Chris?
Glenturr 12.
Yeah, I'm drinking a beer. Okay,
That looks like a wine cooler. That's not a beer.
it is a beer. Come on.
Pink. What kind of beer is pink?
Can I get the lighting team in here?
All right, okay. Moving on. Sorry.
Fix the light. I'm being attacked. Look, it's a beer. It's a beer.
Say so.
Okay.
Oh, you say
All right. All right.
Questioned my gin and tonics earlier. I'm just.
Furman. Okay. We're going to get to this. We are going to ask you questions. That is
talk about history.
basically part of the. We're going to try to talk some history here. Um, Anybody who's interested in history eventually discovers Winston Churchill for themselves. And my interest in Churchill was sparked by the first volume of William Manchester's biography series, The Last Lion, which came out in 1983 when I was some very tender young age. When did you first make your kind of close acquaintanceship with Winston Churchill?
So I got to thank my dad for kind of when I was a little kid telling me about Winston Churchill, quoting or often misquoting a lot of the speeches and telling me about, kind of the finest hour in the Battle of Britain. As a kid, I was really interested in airplanes. So you can't think about, military airplanes without thinking of Battle of Britain and all that stuff. And Churchill was kind of the leader that was present during all that. And my dad and mom made sure I knew all about him and all about the kind of courageous stand he took in, summer of 1940 when the world kind of could have folded and could have gone the other way and surrendered to the Nazis. So kind of ever since I was a little kid, he's been somebody that was on my mind. But honestly, I really didn't know, I'd read half a dozen or so of the major biographies, but really until I wrote this book, I knew the basic story. I knew, probably more about him than your average person, but I was not an expert until I decided to write this book.
Okay. So Daniel, I think, he's one of these characters that is so large in history, and everybody kind of has an opinion of him or an impression of him. It's hard sometimes to sort of peel all those layers back to kind of get a picture of him at an earlier point in time, or what people would have thought. So, just to kind of get started, who is this Winston Churchill guy in 1915, and who is he, like, how well known? Where's he at?
So the short answer is the Winston Churchill of 1915 is somebody you probably wouldn't have liked. He was somebody who most people thought was an obnoxious upstart. He was the son of a very famous British politician, Randolph Churchill. He came from a wealthy and noble family, but he was a guy that had risen very quickly through the ranks of British politics and was something of a know-it-all, something of a snob, kind of a jerky type person. And when was head of the British Admiralty, and when the British Admiralty kind of got blamed when he and the British Admiralty got blamed for the disaster at the Dardanelles at Gallipoli, he was somebody the knives came out for very quickly, because Churchill, as a person you'd want to keep in government, as somebody you'd want to work with, that Churchill is much later. The Churchill of 1915 is somebody who's seen as a know-it-all, show-off, jerky young guy.
And he was, wasn't he?
Yeah, and it kind of always was.
Right.
But, this year that I talk about in the book is the year I say he transitions from that showy, jerky, obnoxious Churchill to a wiser, more seasoned, stronger Churchill.
So you say that this year was his greatest failure and his finest hour. That's a quote. So that's a pretty bold statement in a long life, to put two highs, a low and a high there. So why? Why is it his greatest failure? Why is it his finest hour?
So I think Churchill doesn't become the strong Churchill without failure and resilience that he learned in this year. So the very short answer is, prior to 1915, he had had nothing but successes in his life. He had risen very quickly through British politics. He had kind of been given amazing opportunities, and kind of everything he did was a success. He never really had to struggle. He never really had to, kind of have that gravel in your guts and the spit in your eye to face a hard time. And so when he loses his job in the kind of spring of 1915, and the knives come out for him, and everybody says, I'm glad Churchill lost his job and we don't have to deal with this obnoxious upstart, he has a choice. He can give up and kind of go back to being a son of privilege and kind of this backbencher politician, or he can dig deep and reinvent himself and understand that it's more than just being smart. It's more than just being witty with a turn of phrase. It's more than just being passionate about your job or hardworking or a self-promoter. It's actually, you need to have substance, and you need to learn things, and you need to develop relationships. And and you need to kind of be able to face very, very severe failure. And, we think of Churchill as the Churchill of 1940, standing in the breach when the rest of the world was folding to the Nazis. You don't get a strong, confident Churchill that understands what failure is like, that can rely on being something other than just this rich boy of privilege, without a Churchill that is humbled, without a Churchill that is really taken down a peg. And that's what happens during this year. And fortunately, he's strong enough and mature enough to change the type of person he was and find really an inner strength.
And you say, of course, we'll get more into the details of this as we go along, but kind of along those lines, to help him make this transformation, you say that he receives 5 life-changing gifts. So what are these gifts, and do you think these gifts are the product of luck and circumstance, or are they the product of Churchill kind of looking at himself and saying, something's not right here?
So the 5 gifts, and I can talk about them a lot if you want, but are painting, friendship, personal maturity and growth, time and distance, and then a perspective on modern war. So all of these things are things that kind of help him reinvent himself. I'll just briefly talk about each one, and if you want to pick up one and
Sure.
dive a little deeper, please let me know. But painting is something that came to him almost by accident. He was bored. He didn't have a lot of stuff going on. He had rented a farm out in the country and was, wondering what to do with his life. He sees a paint box and starts experimenting with painting. He's struggling with painting, and one of the wives of one of the most famous painters in Great Britain drives up his driveway and shows him how to paint.
As
and
they do.
almost immediately, and almost immediately,
That happened to me the other day.
This moment though, where he had nothing to do, and almost out of desperation, he reaches for painting, and out of complete luck and chance, one of the wives of one of the most famous painters in Britain just shows up, and it becomes a lifelong passion for him. Painting is important because it becomes his hobby for the rest of his life. And this was a person who did not actually have a hobby until his late 30s. He was 39 when he learned how to paint. And prior to that, he really didn't have any hobbies. He worked, he was very kind of self-focused, but he didn't have a hobby. And he didn't have an outlet for his frustrations other than working and giving speeches and kind of being obnoxious. So painting is one of the big things. Friendship.
Well, and can I just say, and I know you've got 4 other things to mention, but one of the things that I thought was most interesting is that one of his friends commented that when he was painting was the only time that he wasn't talking.
Yes, and it was one of the few things that he could actually escape by doing. Modern psychologists, there's this kind of concept in psychology of flow, of you can do something for a long period of time and kind of be totally immersed by it. This was one of the few things where his mind wasn't wandering and he wasn't thinking about other things. And yes, this person who, weaponized the English language, it was the one time he wouldn't talk. So yeah, it became a consuming passion and really important for him because he did not have a hobby. He did not have kind of an outlet prior to this. He kind of played polo, but he had injured his shoulder a decade or so before and was never quite as good of a polo player. And as he aged, that was something that kind of was not as available to him. But painting became his lifelong hobby. And one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard was don't trust somebody that doesn't have a hobby. He didn't have a hobby prior to this. And this allowed him to have kind of an outlet for when things were good, I can be happy by painting. When things are bad, I can take that frustration and go paint. So it was one of those things that, especially in the 1920s and 30s, when he was in the wilderness period, really kind of saved him and made him kind of be able to have an outlet for his frustrations.
So I interrupted you. You have 4 more gifts to talk about.
I do, and I said I'd be short, and then I'd have
quiet, Rick.
So the second thing is friendship. When the knives came out and Churchill was down, he realized who his friends really were. And there was half a dozen people who stood by him and really backed him up. And many of those people would become critical throughout his life. So his wife, Clementine, was one of his closest friends throughout his entire life, and she backed him up. His friend Archibald Sinclair became a lifelong friend, and their friendship strengthened during this period. I think Archibald Sinclair is probably his best friend, other than his wife Clementine. Just those two examples of those two. It's hard to imagine Churchill as a success, particularly during his difficult periods in the 20s and 30s, without friends, without people that would stand by him. And even during World War II, Archibald Sinclair was the leader of the Liberal Opposition Party and actually protected Churchill's kind of left flank of his coalition government during World War II. There was a couple different no confidence votes against Churchill during World War II, the most severe being after the fall of Tobruk. Archibald Sinclair says, this man is a patriot. There's nobody we can have that is better than this. Do not, vote out Winston Churchill in the middle of a war. His friend from 1915, 1916 covers his political left flank and keeps that coalition government from having a crisis in 1942 after the fall of Tobruk. I just can't, again, a bit of luck, a bit of just, he was a good person and made lifelong friendships. But again, it's hard to imagine him being successful if, in World War II, for example, if, he's perpetually worried about losing his seat as prime minister. So friendship, very, very big part of his life. Personal growth, I've mentioned already several times, Churchill was obnoxious. He was a know-it-all, and he kind of was that way for his entire life. But being taken down a peg made him realize that not everybody was his friend. That not everybody could just be talked off their feet or impressed by how smart he was. I learned that in college. Most smart folks learn that when they're kind of in their early 20s or something. He'd never learned that just being smart or just being well-spoken or just being witty wasn't enough. So he realized that, people will stab you in the back. People will, not be necessarily who they say they are. And Churchill kind of matured and grew as a person in that way. He also, when he spent time in the front lines with some of the troops, it was the longest period of time he'd ever spent with the common people, before or since. He was a privileged person. So having to kind of live in the mud and kind of share the danger and the bad food with common people in the trenches, again, gave him a perspective of what normal British citizens were like, so that he could be more sensitive when 1940 rolls around and he's visiting bombed out houses and he's having small talk with people about the war effort. Just having that kind of common touch. And I want to make sure I'm not overdoing this. Churchill was very privileged. He was not a common man at all. But having that time to kind of mature and meet meet a broader section of people from British society, again, gave him that way with the people that made him so successful later. I say it also gave him time and distance is one of the gifts. So time and distance, the British Liberal Party was a very, very, very toxic place in kind of 1915, 1916, 1917. The party was tearing itself apart over who would be the leader. It had several big crises over conscription, over war production, over war strategy, over a whole bunch of different issues. The Liberal Party was tearing itself apart. Churchill being out of power, it actually saves him from having to take a side on some of these very, very contentious issues. So he would have loved to have been part of them. I mean, let's not get ourselves, confused on that. He wanted to be part of this and was upset that he wasn't. But it was actually a blessing in disguise that he didn't have to take a public position on war strategy, on war production, on kind of the draft in particular. And he didn't have to kind of get in the middle of this fight between the Asquith part of the Liberal Party and the Lloyd George part of the Liberal Party. He could kind of play both sides of all of those issues and kind of hold back and then cast his lot with Lloyd George when it became clear he was going to be kind of the ascendant figure in British politics. So being out of politics or out of the middle of these fights drove him crazy, but was very much a blessing in disguise. And then finally, a perspective on modern war. Churchill spent several months in the trenches observing up close and personal modern warfare. And this is something really important for him because prior to that, he had served in the British Army, but he had a very outdated view of military strategy. So he had served quite bravely in campaigns in modern-day Pakistan, in modern-day Sudan, and in modern-day South Africa. But these were not wars that were particularly modern. And to the extent they were modern, it was the British bringing modern artillery and Maxim guns to a battlefield and slaughtering people without them.
Yeah.
So he had a very outdated view of warfare. Seeing it up close in person, what over the horizon kind of indirect fire artillery can do, seeing what air power can do, seeing what thousands of poison gas shells can do, seeing what machine guns can do when you're on the other side of it, really changed his view of modern warfare. And it would have been very dangerous had he taken this view that he had prior to his experience in the trenches. If he'd have still had that in World War II, it could have been very dangerous. He could have not understood that artillery was going to be the big killer of World War II, that airplanes and modern tanks and things like that really mattered. So learning kind of a more nuanced modern version, modern understanding of warfare, very, very important. And that's the kind of fifth of the 5 gifts SA learns during this period.
So give you a moment there to drink your beer. Let's go back to the early part of the book. So what's going on in the war in 1915? Why is Churchill interested in attacking through the Dardanelles? And I think for some people in the audience, we might say, what the hell are the Dardanelles, or is the Dardanelles straight? Go ahead, Chris.
You've got to use the line, what do you know about the Dardanelles? I wanted to say that the whole show. I have to do it. What do you know about the Dardanelles?
I know very little.
I know somebody's going to tell us, though.
Well, I have a map. We'll just talk here for a moment. But yeah, the Dardanelles is this narrow little strait at the end of that red line that leads into the Sea of Marmara, and Istanbul's on the other end of that. And this is a long ways from the front line in France. And so what the heck are we doing down here? Okay, that's for you.
That's great.
I know that Chris can answer that, but we're looking for you to answer it.
So Churchill, from very early on in the war, was frustrated that the British couldn't achieve a rapid victory. And
Churchill is the first Lord of the Admiralty.
So I was just going to say, he's the first Lord of the Admiralty. He's basically the civilian head of the Royal Navy. And he's actually getting a lot of pressure from British politicians, from the British public of, we have the world's finest fleet, and it basically isn't doing anything. We've kept the German fleet at bay in their harbors at Kiel, but we really haven't, done anything with the Royal Navy. So he was under an enormous pressure from the people and from the politicians to do something proactively with the Royal Navy. He also was personally frustrated that, by late 1914, you'd had a kind of a stalemate on the Western Front where the lines of trenches were pretty much from the English Channel to the Swiss border, and there wasn't any place for maneuver or kind of decisive battle. So part of this is he was frustrated, and part of this he was looking for something to do with the Royal Navy. Okay. But actually the reason the British actually kind of thought about this campaign in modern day Turkey, thousands of miles away from the Western Front, was to actually protect the Russian allies. The Ottomans, the modern day Turks, actually had been fighting the Russians, and the Russians on their kind of southern flank were initially getting pushed back by the Ottoman forces, and they were panicking. So they sent a message to the British, what can you do to relieve pressure on the Russian military because they're getting pushed back by the Turks. Turks fought a very good kind of initial campaign in November and December of 1914. Russian army panics, but they eventually can kind of stabilize their lines, and they fight a very good winter campaign, as the Russians often do. So his attention on Turkey and kind of the Dardanelles Peninsula down there at first comes because the Ottomans were pushing the Russians back, and the Russians were panicking, and the Russians were the allies of the British. But he sees this kind of as a potential to use British naval power to blast through this narrow piece of water. The Ottomans had put a series of naval mines and a series of large caliber guns on both sides of that narrow piece of water, and in effect sealed off the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea from Allied naval power. Churchill says, well, we have all these old, about 15, 20-year-old pre-dreadnought battleships that aren't doing anything. They're not fast enough to kind of be used in major sea actions against the Germans. They're not heavy enough caliber guns to fight the Germans. They're basically just wasting away. So he says, but they're manned. They're pretty powerful ships. They're just not good enough for fighting kind of modern naval battles. He says, if we use these older classes of ships to basically blast our way through this fortified area against the Turks, against the Ottomans, and then basically push towards Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, and park the Royal Navy off the shores and say, you need to leave the war, you need to negotiate an end to the war. He thought of this as a way of knocking out one of the big belligerent powers that was kind of fighting against Britain and their allies. And it was as a way to, again, make himself and the Royal Navy useful and hopefully break a stalemate that had kind of, confounded the Allied planners. So at first he saw this as a very easy, low risk, low cost, we're not doing anything with these outdated ships type mission. And as military plans often go, they got this mission got more and more complex and resourced more and more heavily, and the enemy gets a vote too. So the initial plan to blast through with these outdated warships doesn't work. Basically, the short answer is the British naval artillery fire wasn't as accurate as they thought it would be, and Ottoman naval mines were more deadly than they were kind of anticipated to be. So they're not able to blast through using these outdated ships. So they do a amphibious invasion of that little peninsula that you showed on the map. That little peninsula creates about 300,000 Allied casualties. And after about a year, the British and their allies retreat from there and have achieved almost nothing. Okay, they've had an enormous amount of casualties to briefly hold a tiny bit of beach on this little tiny peninsula, way away from the main theaters of the war. Before the campaign's even over, Churchill is blamed for it. And as head of the Royal Navy, that's partially fair and partially not fair. But he gets blamed for it either way and loses his job, and then is frustrated that this campaign's still going on, that he's still getting blamed for it, but there's nothing he can do to actually influence the campaign. So it's kind of this contingent series of things to where all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of people are fighting thousands of miles away against a second tier enemy to help the Russians out, because initially we thought old battleships could blast through there and knock out the Ottoman Empire. So it's a complex series of events, but it all comes back on Churchill, and he gets the blame for it.
Yeah, so I think kind of picking up on that, because you'll have to write another book about the Dardanelles, or we can recommend. But as you kind of hint at, it doesn't turn out so well for the British. But what you get into in the book, which I think is more important for what we're talking about, is its impact on Churchill. This is something that I would say affects him deeply, and not just for a short period of time. This is, you mentioned accounts of much decades later, he's still saying no. So maybe you can touch a little bit about the impact of this defeat on him, and what that does to him going forward.
On both a personal and a kind of career political level, this is devastating for Churchill. So I spent most of my previous comments talking about how he gets blamed for this politically and loses his job over it.
Right.
From a psychological standpoint,
Right.
this is devastating for him. As even after he died, so in the mid 1960s, his wife Clementine was asked what the kind of biggest regret Churchill had was, and without hesitating, this is 50 years after the fact, with lots of other very kind of contentious things that happened in between then. Without hesitating, she says the Dardanelles. And she then adds, I thought it would have been his grave. I thought he would have worried himself to death over this. So again, it fits into this pattern of this was his first really big, really public mistake. 300,000 Allied soldiers are killed or wounded for nothing. And it's this what if, because he apparently till his dying day believed that if they'd have acted faster or pushed harder or done some of the things he said early in the campaign before losing his job, that this could have actually been a great victory for the Allies. And it could have knocked the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It could have shortened the war. It could have made the stalemate on the Western Front largely irrelevant because you can kind of go around. So he really, really believed this was something that could have worked. The other thing that I didn't mention is his political opposition. They'd seen him, as I mentioned, this kind of obnoxious upstart type character. If you want evidence to support that hypothesis that Churchill is dangerous, he's obnoxious, he's a know-it-all, he will get you in trouble. Oh, he planned this campaign and messed up, and 300,000 people were killed or wounded over it. Therefore, that is the evidence that he is a dangerous liability and should not be trusted. His political enemies would bring this up until the early 1940s as evidence of him being impetuous, as him being kind of a schemer, an amateurish planner and things like that. The political call, what about the Dardanelles, was a heckle that would follow him for the next 25 years. He could be giving a speech on, British policy in India, and somebody would heckle him, what about the Dardanelles? And he almost always fall for that bait and get sidetracked during one of his speeches with one of these heckles and start defending his conduct years before, when it's completely irrelevant to what he's talking about in the 20s or 30s or early 40s. So it was truly a career moment for him, a career inflection, a personal wound, and then something that the opposition and the people that wanted to ruin his career, wanted to bring him down, seized upon and used against him for a very long time to come.
There's another, I want to get on to Churchill in the trenches, but I cannot resist bringing up another character in the Dardanelles story who is maybe even a more colorful character than Winston Churchill, maybe even more obnoxious, more of an upstart, more of an arrogant whatever. And his name is Jackie Fisher. And he is Churchill's the first Lord of the Admiralty. Jackie Fisher is the first Sea Lord. Just tell us a little bit about this guy and what his role is in this whole thing with and his relationship with Churchill.
So John Fisher, commonly called Jackie, was the first Sea Lord, as you said. That's the top military commander of the Royal Navy. Jackie Fisher was one of the most interesting people you could imagine, and was just as much of an egotist, just as much of a schemer as Churchill. And they had such an unusual working relationship with each other. Jackie Fisher by this time is in his early 70s. Churchill's in his late 30s, but they adore each other. It's kind of like brothers, and in both good and bad sense of the way.
Yeah,
they love each other, but then they'll fight like crazy. They were always threatening each other. Churchill threatened to fire Jackie Fisher several times. Jackie Fisher, I think it was 8 times, threatened to resign. They were enormous egos, but they were also enormously patriotic and enormously, brilliant in their own ways. So
it
Jackie
does sound
Fisher,
a lot like Chris and I. Okay,
yeah. Jackie Fisher is famous for a bunch of things, but he really modernized the Royal Navy in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, brought about the dreadnought class battleships, invested very heavily in modern torpedo technology and fast torpedo boat technology, was really kind of both a salty kind of old-fashioned sailor, but also a modern kind of reformer type person as well. Churchill loved him and Churchill hated him, and they feuded like cats and dogs. And one of the things that actually led to Churchill's dismissal as First Lord of the Admiralty was when Jackie Fisher actually made good on one of his threats to resign after Churchill had gone behind his back and reassigned a couple of ships to a different part of the fleet without telling Jackie Fisher. And then Jackie Fisher was so petulant after resigning, the king actually ordered him back to his job, return to your post, and he refused to do so. He actually went and he rented a hotel room and hid from the king and from the prime minister who were begging him to return to his job. It's one of those things where it's almost too crazy or too colorful or too whatever to believe. And Churchill and Fisher, frenemies is, I guess, how the young people would say it now. They loved and hated each other simultaneously with equal passion.
I'm thinking that you are one of the young people. I mean, compared to Winston and I, you're anyway. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I did write this book as a 39-year-old when I was the same age as Churchill during a lot of this stuff, and it was actually kind of my midlife crisis and his midlife crisis playing out in parallel. So I don't know if I'm young anymore. My college students certainly don't think I'm young. I don't feel young that first 10 or 15 steps out of bed either.
Well, as long as you don't point to any of your friends and call them Jackie, they might get a little nervous.
Wait 30 years and then look back on your 39-year-old time as a time of great youth and freedom. Mr. Anderson.
Never gets any better, I guess.
No. Oh, well, it does. Lots of things get better, but you do get older.
So moving on from well, yes. What he doesn't. All right, so he loses his job, forced out. He's kind of labeled, whether for good or for ill, as the person who's largely responsible for this. You have some great quotes in the book about how people sum him up, but he also has to go through a sort of a further humiliation. He gets another gig, which isn't like sit really well. He doesn't go right to the trenches, right? So what's happening to him as he's watching his world sort of unravel? So
he's actually allowed to stay in the Asquith government after losing his job as First Lord of the Admiralty. Asquith's motivations were, if we totally kick Churchill out right away, it'll look like we're stomping on him when he's down. And if we include him in our cabinet in basically a ceremonial position, we can kind of order him to shut up to the extent anybody could order Winston Churchill to shut up. Keeping him in the government and actually entrusting him with secrets that he couldn't then go blab to the press and things like that was actually a strategy to soften the blow on Churchill, but also kind of protect the Asquith government from not having Churchill on the outside of government kind of causing problems for him. I'm reminded of what Lyndon Johnson said about J. Edgar Hoover. He'd rather have him inside the tent peeing out than outside the tent peeing in. I think he said it a little cruder than that, but it was basically like that. So he was given this basically meaningless position, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So basically, it was it's still a cabinet level position, but basically you collect rents on behalf of the king for any kind of property in Lancaster that the king owns and can collect rents on. So it was basically a secretary's position of make sure the king's rents are collected on time and that the books are balanced. Churchill could do this in a couple hours a week. It was basically a no-show job, but it muzzled him by keeping him in the cabinet and making him privy to secret information, or that he couldn't then go blab it or couldn't then give openly hostile speeches against the Asquith government.
And so So then, okay, so how is he so easily able? I was curious about this. He's in the cabinet. He's going to leave the cabinet, and he just sort of glides into his position in the army in France, like they had been holding something for him the whole time. So how is he able to do that so easily?
So once again, he's lucky and he's privileged, and the way British politics worked at that time and the way the British military worked at that time kind of allowed him to do it. So he had a reserve commission in the British Army. So he was a reserve major. And he had that position. He actually maintained his position as a reserve major until very late in his life, until he was in his 70s. So he has a reserve commission. He quits the government and basically unannounced travels on a steamer, a troop ship across the channel, and just shows up in France. He gives a brief amount of warning to General French, the head of the British military, that he's coming and they'd like a job. But basically, he shows up mostly unannounced with very little warning and asks for a position and doesn't have anything lined up before he gets on that boat, doesn't know what he's going to get into when he steps off that boat. But a car is waiting for him when he does get off that boat. It takes him directly to General French's headquarters, General John French, and they have dinner, and French kind of puts him on the path to military command. Fortunately for Churchill, or unfortunately for the British military, they were burning through field grade officers at a just alarming rate during that period. So showing up and saying, I'm a reserve major, put me in the line, there was always a need for that. Churchill was lucky to get some pretty plush positions and kind of fast-tracked by John French, who was actually his friend, towards he was going to get a brigade command, which would have come with a brigadier general rank. But eventually General French gets replaced by Douglas Haig, and Churchill's kind of promised for a brigade command gets pulled. But it's actually just a kind of one of those coincidences. Churchill doesn't have anything lined up, but he does have a reserve commission, so he knows he'll at least get a major's billet. He shows up, and his friend has just enough warning to invite him over to dinner, and his friend just happens to be John French, the head of the British Expeditionary Force, and then promises him a brigade command. That doesn't pan out, but he ends up getting a battalion command, basically with very little planning and a good bit of luck on his part.
One of the questions I frequently get when I'm taking people on tours, and I do a tour of the Western Front, and I take people to the spots where Churchill was, is this a genuine move on his act? Is he trying to just kind of forget everything and throw himself into something? Does he see this as a step? As a stepping stone? Is he? And of course, the other question, and we can get more into this, is does he actually become a real soldier? Right? Or is he just kind of there to dress up?
Just kind of playing soldier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is he LARPing, basically?
Yeah.
No, I think there was always an element with Churchill of calculation. Right. And I think the calculation he made was his political career was at a dead end if he stayed in London. He could keep his seat in the House of Commons and be a backbencher, but he would always be seen as a failure. But if he goes to the Western Front, serves 6 months or so there, he can kind of put his money where his mouth is. He can make it where it's hard to criticize the rich kid that's old enough and rich enough and privileged enough and an MP enough not to. It's hard to criticize that person when they're in a trench and exposed to artillery fire and serving the way they didn't have to. So I think he makes this calculation that I will either die and I'll die a hero and I'm fine with that, or I'll kind of purify myself and this sacrifice, this time at the front will allow me to kind of prove that I'm courageous and prove that you might not like what I did at the Dardanelles, but you cannot argue with my military service. And so I think that was the calculation. Was he a real soldier? Absolutely. He did pack too much stuff. He packed a hot tub. He packed way more kind of food and personal equipment than he was allowed. But he absolutely was a soldier, and he shared risks with his men that he absolutely did not have to. He enjoyed going on expeditions, cutting wire in between the trenches in no man's land at night. He would go out on small groups on patrol and cut wire in between there. He spent most of the time every day in the trenches. And as I mentioned, even during quiet periods at the front, 3 or 4 people out of the battalion of about 600 folks would get artillery splinter casualties every day, even during a quiet section of the front. Just a couple shells a day, get a couple casualties a day. So it's kind of a grim math that he was doing something where every day 1% or 2 of his unit came down as casualties. That could have been him. And I mentioned in the book, he has about a half a dozen really close calls where, he was in one part of the trench, 5 minutes later, that trench is blown up, or a shell hits his house and it doesn't blow up. And if it had blown up, he'd have been a pile of goo in the corner. So certainly he took an enormous amount of risk, an enormous amount of danger that he did not have to. He was also lucky once his unit kind of got he got combined with another unit. He left the military, and he was lucky to leave just a month or so before the British offensive at the Somme, which would have absolutely devastated the unit. He left, and quite possibly would have made him a casualty there. But during the time he was there, he was in pretty constant danger. And he was in conditions that were muddy and cold and wet and gross, and certainly not something he was used to. So did he have an easier time than a lot of soldiers? Yes, absolutely. Did he leave at a convenient time right before the offensive at the Somme? Yes, absolutely. Did he set up a hot tub so he could take a hot bath every couple of days? Yeah. Did he have his wife send him food from London every couple of days? Yeah. But what he did was dangerous, and what he did was courageous, and he certainly did not have to do it. But like I said, I think he did it largely out of this notion of calculation. I have nothing to lose. I might kind of redeem myself by my sacrifice.
Well, and you talk about, you do paint there's a scene where his tub is being dragged to the front lines is sort of one of the more amusing scenes in the book. But you do talk about how the soldiers that he's serving over look at him pretty questioningly when he gets there, but he wins them over, doesn't he?
Yes. So the initial reaction, you're exactly right, Rick, is one of, who is this rich boy politician? What does he have to prove? Why does my unit have to take this guy on? He's going to get us all killed. That's kind of the initial reaction, and it's completely understandable. Churchill does himself no favors by kind of being a petty tyrant the first day or so on the job, ordering a parade and then missing various commands, giving speeches that were long-winded and threatening to the people, saying, if you cross me, I will break you. He starts with a bad kind of vibe and makes it worse the first day or two. But almost immediately after that, he changes tactics and says, I don't need to be a petty tyrant. I don't need to give speeches. I need to show these people that I am brave too. I need to show these people that I can make their lives better. I need to kind of show that I'm sharing the sacrifices that they are. And the real turning point on his leadership in the front was he realizes his unit had a lice problem. There was millions of little tiny bugs crawling on people's skin and passing diseases and making their skin literally crawl with itching. So he creates a kind of a culture of cleanliness where people clean their sheets, change their socks, pick lice off their fellow soldiers. And there's a brewery, an abandoned brewery not far from the front lines where they're stationed in Belgium, that has these large tanks. And he uses the tanks as boiling pots for clothes, for underwear and blankets and sheets and uniform clothing, and boils them so that it kills the lice. And within a couple of days, this is a lice-free battalion, or is as close to a lice-free battalion as you can get in the mud and trenches. And morale immediately goes up. Wow, this guy solved a very real problem that was affecting me. I will follow somebody if they're solving my problems and making my life better and showing they care. And that's kind of the turning point for his time as a leader, is what I call Churchill's war on lice. But yeah, but you're exactly right. At first, they did not want this dude, and they were like, "Why me?" And he dug a hole, but he corrected. And again, when you go back to that kind of gift of personal growth and maturity, I think 6 months before, Churchill doesn't have that type of humbleness, that type of understanding of himself, that I can't just give a speech and I can't just be a petty tyrant. I have to actually do stuff. I actually have to deliver something for my men.
Yeah. But Furman, do you think he's sitting there in a bunker at Plug Street, kind of reviewing the end of the day, going, "Boy, I kind of blew that. I got to change here," or do you think it just sort of is an evolutionary process? I mean, do you think he's grappling with these things, or?
I think he realized almost right away that he screwed up.
Yeah.
And for him, someone as arrogant and as proud and as as Churchill was,
yeah.
I think that was really hard for him to do.
Yeah.
And when you tell a story of growth as a leader, growth as a person, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
I can't just win people over with my personality or my speeches. I have to be better.
Yeah.
And I think that was a moment that he became, took a major step for being that person. Then when he goes and visits, the working class person in London whose house got bombed, he can have that moment of empathy. He can have that kindness and goodness. And, I might not be able to rebuild your house, but I am here standing in the rubble telling you we're going to give it back to Hitler 2 times worse tomorrow. Yeah. And I think, as a political scientist, I'm trained to say that type of leadership doesn't matter, but I certainly think it does. And again, I've only had one beer, so I'm not getting too emotional about it, but I really do think that type of empathy and leadership is what made Churchill different in 1940 than he was in 1915, and would have been without this kind of major gut-wrenching year that I talk about.
So we haven't been able to take too many questions from our viewers, but I'll pop one up here as we come close to our ending, and this is from Nancy Nallens, and she says, "After all your research, how do you come away feeling about him? Do you admire him?" And I would add to that, because you could just say yes or no and answer the question there, but you would also, I would like to know sort of how did the research that you do on this book, did it make you admire him more? Did it make you view him as more complicated? Kind of how did it change your perceptions of Churchill?
Mm-hmm. So Nancy, thanks for your question. So I do admire him, and it's unusual because I wrote 2 books on George Patton, and after writing those, I didn't admire him that much.
Okay, you had just made a friend for life with Chris Anderson.
But no, I admire him, but I admire him in a different way. Because I admired him for these speeches, and I admired him for the V for Victory and the, never in the field of human conquest has been so much been owed by so many to so few. Like those type of things is what I admired him for. I admired him after this because I saw a character and a genuineness and a humbleness and a vulnerability and a growth as a person. And that to me is a lot more interesting. And there's a lot more to admire there than somebody that's just good at giving speeches, or that's just a politician, or just happened to be the leader that won World War II as the head of the British government. So the kind of how did we get to that Churchill that is able to do that's why I admire him. And the other thing I will add, I do not like the Churchill of 1915. I that should be very clear from my comments here. I thought he's a jerk. I would not have liked him. I'd have probably been, if I was a British politician or in the British public, loses his job, gets his comeuppance, good. But as a biographer, as someone who studied a lot, that learning process, that growth process, that evolution of his character, I admire that a lot. And I would hope that everybody could grow as a person the way he did.
So that's actually good, because it's going to pick up on kind of my question. The book is, it's, I don't know if it's not published by, but it's on AUSA's list of, of books to read. AUSA is an organization that's made up of Army officers, active and retired. So I'm assuming that they're advocating their members read this book for a reason. So what do you think that they hope people who read this book will get out of it? I mean,
a growth mindset and a leadership mindset and a servant mindset, I think, is what the AUSA wants out of it. And again, when I've talked to military folks, I'll tell them, look, nobody is a natural. Even Churchill could grow as a leader, could grow as a military officer, could grow as a person, could grow even as a speech giver. And I think that tale of growth and that tale of, it's more than just being, a politician. It's more than just being a gets it guy. I have to see the situation, see my imperfections, see the challenges ahead of me, and be confident enough and dedicated to my craft enough, and all those types of things to actually become better at my job. And I think military leaders are challenged with that stuff all the time. The type, warfare is always changing. The personnel under your command are changing. The challenges are changing. And if you're not growing as a leader or growing as a person, if you're not developing your own confidence, your own skills, you're not doing your job. You're leaving something on the table and potentially not being the leader that your people will need. So I think that's what AUSA wants out of it. That's certainly what I've told them that I think that they want out of it.
Well put.
Fair enough. So, Furman Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book, Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint, The Remarkable Year That Made Winston Churchill. It's been fantastic, a great conversation, and we so appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much, Chris
really
and Rick. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, cheers. Take care.
Thank you.
Oh, bye-bye.
Oh, that was really good. Good audience, good guest, good topic.
And he doesn't like patents, so.
And he doesn't like patents, so I mean, he's. We could invite him back for next week.
Christmas.
Christmas. Maybe make him a co-host. I don't know. So next week we're gonna actually welcome someone who is watching this week's show, because I saw him there leaving a comment. John Langelier, who is our fellow Stephen Ambrose historian, and he's going to be talking about his book, Buffalo Soldiers in Arizona. And he's been on History Happy Hour before, so it's a return visit. And we're going to be delighted to chat with John Langelier about black soldiers in Arizona from basically 1881 through World War II. So whole range of time there, and I'm sure he's got some interesting stories and observations about that, because he always does.
And he always wears interesting shirts. So
yeah, he does. So it'll be very different than this week's show, but hopefully just as good and just as popular. And Chris, I want to add a program reminder for anybody who's interested in this. Don't forget to tune into the 50th anniversary of Saturday Night Live tonight, not on a Saturday, not at 11:30 at night.
Everybody's too old to stay up.
It's a Sunday. It's a Sunday at 8 p.m. I know Lorne Michaels is 80, and I think Garrett Morris. I think he's 87 or something. So maybe he'll be in the audience cheering them on. I don't know. Anyway. It's not important, but it's there. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.